Colin, there's there's going to be a lot of soul searching here about not only what incited this riot, but of course also the police response or lack of response in an appropriate size. What do you think is the solution here to making sure not only that our Capitol and our buildings are protected, but more importantly, that we're not encouraging the type of behavior that was clearly encouraged yesterday?
Well, it's rather simple. Don't have a president that incites violence. Don't have a president that calls for his followers to come down and do exactly what we saw yesterday. I don't mean to be trite, but none of this is a surprise. Analysts have been tracking this for weeks and months. I wrote a piece in the LA Times in late November saying the president's rhetoric is laying the groundwork for the type of violence we saw unfold yesterday, and I was called an alarmist. For anyone paying attention, this outcome was likely inevitable.
Likely inevitable, and we need to hold, I'm sure, social media companies to account. We need to hold media companies. I need to hold a mirror up to myself and hold ourselves to account as well as to whether we allowed this sort of vitriol across many a platform to become in some way mainstream. From your perspective, though, how do we move on from this? How do we backtrack? Do we gain some sort of sense of normalcy once again as to what can and can't be said?
Well, I think there's got to be accountability, right? And whether that comes in the form of the 25th Amendment, impeachment, or really, it's really not that difficult. If you look at the law and you look at what the law around insurrection says, and then you enforce the law, right? We still are a nation of laws. If you enforce the law, I think that sets the right tone. It sends the right message to our allies abroad and to our adversaries. And make no mistake, they're all watching closely about how the United States is going to behave in the world. You mentioned media companies. I think, many, especially on, the far right, have become rage profiteers. And I think, social media companies bear a lot of responsibility as well. They banned President Trump from Facebook, but I say too little, too late.
What changed yesterday in the eyes of foreign bad actors on how they perceive us?
Well, I think they see how vulnerable we are, right? That the Capitol was able to be breached so easily. The fact that you had marauding gangs roving around the Capitol, with access to files, computers, to guest pass, right,
Yeah.
or identification, that was really telling, I think, to a lot of adversaries that were watching rather closely.
And without getting too much into speculation here, I mean, there's a lot of concern about the response by police and law enforcement, whether it was appropriate enough to begin with at the start, and whether during the violence, some of the actions by those officers was appropriate as well. At the end of the Obama administration, towards the end, there was a report put out by the DOJ that was looking to investigate the infiltration of a lot of our police forces by white supremacist groups and by nationalist groups. That report was pretty much torn up and thrown into the garbage once Trump took office in 2016. Is there any sense here that this is something we should be paying more attention to?
Clearly, that can't be more obvious at this point. About an hour after we saw images coming from the Capitol yesterday, we noticed on Telegram channels that white supremacists and neo-Nazis were using imagery from the storming of the Capitol as propaganda, as a recruitment tool, and likely to fundraise in the future. So it didn't take long. And if you could, as the images showed, from the apparel and from some of the tattoos, there were apparent neo-Nazis and white supremacists scattered among those groups. They've been saying they were going to come here for weeks. So it's no surprise that they showed up and that they wreaked havoc.
Colin, you mentioned Telegram. Are there any other areas of social media that we need to look to just briefly? We've got another 30 seconds or so.
Yeah, I mean, we're now seeing these individuals migrate to Parler, to Gab, to other kind of more obscure, marginalized platforms. But I think, we need to do a wholesale reassessment of how media and social media deals with threats of domestic terrorism and incitement to violence.